All righty. Hey, y'all. Welcome. Happy Friday. Also, happy B-Day for Beyonce fans out there. Welcome to the Social Studies series presented by the Center for Civic Innovation. My name is Asile. I'm Civic Engagement Manager here at CCI, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kyle. Hey, Kyle. And we're going to be
Hey, Sal.
talking about neighborhood power today. So before we get started, we wanted to just get a sense of who was in the audience, who was in the virtual room, to get a better sense for when we're presenting the information, who we are with. So Kyle is going to share those results for us just to get a sense of who we're talking to today.
So from the folks who were able to take our short little quiz, it appears that most of you live in the city of Atlanta. 80% of folks are city of Atlanta residents. Those of you, we asked if you know what neighborhood in NPU you live in. Most of you know what neighborhood you live in. Many of you also know what NPU you live in. Maybe thankfully, nobody doesn't know what an NPU is, but we'll talk about that as well. Regarding involvement in neighborhoods, some of you aren't involved at all, but we have the most number of people who have attended at least an in-person meeting. We'll be talking about those as well as some of the virtual neighborhood meetings that have been going on. Regarding how much power people think neighborhoods currently have, the overwhelming majority say that neighborhoods have too little power. And the overwhelming majority say neighborhoods should have more power than they currently do. So we'll be sure to discuss that in our panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyle. So we are first going to just give a little introduction to CCI for the people that might be unfamiliar with us as an organization. So CCI is an organization that fights to end social and economic inequality in Atlanta. We love Atlanta, we care about Atlanta, and CCI actually has a birthday coming up. We are turning 6 as an organization, which is really exciting. And some of the main things that we want to do is inspire people to take action, whether that's in their neighborhoods, as we're talking about today, or in other means. And investing in what we also like to do is invest in homegrown ideas to help fight social and economic inequality, as well as advocate for policy change in the city. The purpose of this social studies program, just for you all who may be tuning in for the first time, this is a monthly series that highlights the importance of civic engagement in Atlanta across the board. So in the past, we have done back to school presentations on Atlanta Public Schools specifically, and go teams and school board involvement. We've talked about the census, and this is a topic that is near and dear to our heart this month with neighborhood power, which we're going to get into in a little bit. So that's just an overview of CCI and social studies. And now for the moment we've been waiting on, we're going to be talking about neighborhood power today. So just to give you an overview for those of you who may be note takers out there, we're going to be talking about what community engagement is, and then we're going to get into some of those layers of community engagement that we see in Atlanta, and then share some data with you guys that's organized by some of the neighborhood confines that we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that we're really excited about in particular is talking about these different layers, because what we want to be able to show is there's so many different ways to be able to get involved on the neighborhood level, and some people may be more familiar with others. So we're going to get into all of that today. So the first thing that we wanted to do before we started talking about the specific layers of community engagement in Atlanta is really map out the landscape of community engagement and what that looks like. And the first thing that we wanted to do is define what we mean when we're talking about community engagement and what we're talking about. So one of the things that we want to do first is talk about community. And we took this definition from the Atlanta Community Engagement Playbook, which we've hyperlinked here. And what we talk about before we start talking about neighborhoods is understanding that community is a group of people that may not be spatially connected, but may share common interests, concerns, identities. It's been a little bit difficult to tap into community sometimes, especially recently with everyone being at home and stuff like that. And I know I'm not the only one that misses that spatial connection and being a part of communities in the physical sense. But in general, when we talk about community, we're talking about people who share common interests or goals or concerns. And there are tons of communities in Atlanta who identify based on their religion, ethnicity, hobbies, political beliefs, favorite sports teams. Community can be anything. We won't be concentrating on all types of community today, but we're going to be focused on communities that are connected spatially on the neighborhood and NPU level. So with that, Atlanta's made up of a variety of engagement levels. And today specifically, we're going to be talking about a few layers: the neighborhood layer, the NPU layer, and the APAB layer. And if you're not familiar with those acronyms, there are tons of acronyms that get thrown around when talking about neighborhood work. And we're going to make sure to define those for you so that way you're familiar and up to speed as we're continuing to speak. So the first one that we're going to be talking about today is neighborhoods. And I'm going to kick it off to Kyle, who has a near and dear connection to neighborhoods himself, which he'll talk about in a little bit.
Thanks, Asile. So we will be talking about neighborhoods to start with, that first level up from just an individual resident who wants to get involved in citizen engagement in the city of Atlanta. So let's take it all the way back. Let's take it back to Old English, if you will, to the very sort of roots of what neighborhood means, what that word means. So rather than looking at a definition from the community playbook, we are going to be looking at that etymological root of this word. So I'm not going to try to pronounce Old English. That is not my specialty whatsoever. But if you look at this word and break it down to the parts, the first part, neighbor, means someone who lives nearby, and the hood isn't a hood like we talk about today. It's a state of being, and that word still sort of exists, or that ending exists with words like childhood, adulthood, sainthood, those sort of things. We still have the word hood used for that state of being. But since the 1620s thereabouts, these words have come together to mean a community of people who live close together. So let's not stay so far back. Let's move a little bit closer to the present. And this is what the current City of Atlanta definition of a neighborhood is. And the key takeaway here to take a look at is that a neighborhood is both a geographic place that has some distinguishing characteristics or a sense of identity. But what's also key there is that the existence of a group or a series of groups that are devoted to preserving and improving that place are also important. So we've taken a look at the sort of basis of the word and then the definition of the word. And now we are going to take a look at a map. So this is the City of Atlanta's official map of neighborhoods. There are currently 244 neighborhoods in the City of Atlanta. This is a map that was most recently updated in 2017 when the Peyton Heights neighborhood was added to the map. Now, if you're looking at this map, you might be wondering, why are there holes in this map? Well, if you're familiar with your Atlanta geography, some of those places might stand out to you as a park or a cemetery or as another large industrial property. And these are mainly places that people don't typically live. So as we stated before, that neighborhood is where people are living, and the neighborhood is the people who are living there. So for some of these places, there's not anyone living there, so no one has claimed it necessarily as a neighborhood. You might also notice there's something, looks like Piedmont Park. So some of these spots too, or maybe they're contested, they're part of multiple neighborhoods, or they're the boundary between a couple neighborhoods. So that might also be why they're not clearly shown as a neighborhood on the map. Now, if you think there's something wrong with the map, there is definitely a way that you can help change that, and that is to talk to your city council member. This map is officially revised through legislation. So if you look on the city's map and your neighborhood's not there, or it's not the name you recognize, or you want to see something changed, you know, one of the sort of glaring spots with this map too is that our new annexation of Emory University hasn't been classified as a neighborhood yet. So if you are on this call and you're in Emory and you want to be an official neighborhood in the city of Atlanta, please reach out to your city council member and get that taken care of. But all right, before we get too much further into neighborhoods, since we were talking about both the people and the physical geography, let's talk about some of those groups that are there. So neighborhood associations. Now this might sound like a little bit of a boring topic, but hopefully we can make it a little bit more interesting for you and make it something that you will want to get involved in, whether that's an existing neighborhood association or possibly even starting your own. So whereas before we went back to Old English in the 1600s, this time we're only going back to about 1800, when a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville visited what was still a very new country here in the United States. And he found it quite remarkable that local citizens, if they realized that there was a need or a problem that was out there in their community that needed to be worked on, that what would they do? They wouldn't go tell somebody else to do it. They would go speak to their neighbor, and they would form a committee to help resolve that problem. So that type of activity still happens to this day. Maybe it's not unique to America, but it was definitely something that was part of our early democracy in this country. Now, to bring it a little bit closer to home here in Atlanta, and the neighborhood associations, committees, and organizations we have, many of them were founded in the 1960s and 70s because there was the problem that people saw out in the world was this development activity, particularly highway, freeway development that was going to come through and destroy their neighborhoods. So many of the civic associations we have in Atlanta, although there are some that date back to the 1920s that are more sort of garden clubs or general sort of civic improvement organizations, but many of the ones that today are sort of the bedrock of the neighborhood planning unit system and are members of the sort of neighborhood associations across the city, grew out of that 1960s and 1970s political action against the highways that were coming in. And there was this decades-long fight between the residents and the Georgia Department of Transportation about these freeways that would have completely destroyed these neighborhoods. So that's where many of the neighborhood associations we know today came from, but that is not necessarily what they are up to these days. So once again, bringing it even a little closer to the present, this is a quote from 1975 talking about these neighborhood organizations. So once again, many of them were formed out of opposition to something. They were created to fight a particular zoning change, or they were there to fight those highways that were coming in. But as they have lasted, as they've stayed around since then, they have grown and evolved into becoming something that is trying to be proactive, trying to address issues before they happen, and hopefully stem off those proposed changes that would completely destroy the neighborhoods well in advance, rather than having to wait until that to the demolition crews are showing up and it's too late to hold them back. So for neighborhoods today, what do neighborhood associations do? They do a wide variety of things. They do things like newsletters and websites. They're on social media, of course. They have meetings, they have committees. They're still, maybe not today, knocking on doors to meet their neighbors, but they're still convening whenever it's appropriate on social media or on Zoom platforms like this. They're also hosting festivals, block parties, activities, other social events, just trying to make sure that neighbors feel connected with each other. They're doing beautification projects, cleanup projects, other things to make sure that the neighborhood, it looks presentable and it's attractive and there's a high quality of life there. And many of our neighborhood associations in the city of Atlanta also have security patrols as well. Now, it's difficult for us to give you a one-size-fits-all description of neighborhood associations because they are so different across the city. However, here are a few things that we would like you to know about them. Some of them are registered corporations with the state of Georgia. This means that they're legal entities, and that gives them certain rights and obligations. For instance, a legal entity can be sued, but it can also sue other folks. So that is something that might play out in some of the discussion we have later, where neighborhoods have taken a very active stance and wanted to make sure that you know, that their thoughts were considered in some legal action. Some neighborhood associations have a nonprofit status with the IRS. So ones that are classified as a 501c3 organization, they're exempt from taxes, and any donation you make to them would be tax deductible on your own personal tax return. Some of them do meet regularly, as often as monthly, but other ones just meet annually, which is once a year. And some of them just meet whenever there's a need arises. So they are sort of on an ad hoc, at call basis, rather than having a regular routine of meeting on a regular basis. Now, some neighborhood associations do have restrictions on membership or charge dues. Some of those limitations on membership are based upon being a homeowner in a specific geography. Some of them do charge dues to cover expenses like the security patrols I mentioned earlier, or the publication of newsletters. Some of them maintain parks or pools or other things as well. So just depending on the particular organization, they might charge dues or have some other restrictions where it might not be open membership to anybody and everybody who's interested in participating. Now, a few things to note about the city of Atlanta and its connection to neighborhoods is that the city of Atlanta does not have any official process for recognizing neighborhood organizations or associations. Now, that's not to say that the city of Atlanta just pretends that they don't exist, because obviously they do. But because of some of the things we'll talk about in a minute, the city of Atlanta has historically chosen to interact with neighborhoods in a slightly different way. So the city does maintain a director, or at least attempts to maintain a director of neighborhood groups across the city. So that folks inside the city and as well outside the city can remain in contact with folks in neighborhoods across the city. The current contact list, the current list has 148 groups, but we presume, even my neighborhood association is not listed in the group. or in the directory. As Asal alluded to earlier, I am a former president of the Atlanta Downtown Neighborhood Association, and that list is missing many groups, but there are probably some groups that are on that list that aren't very active, or maybe have been combined with other groups since then as well. Now, we do want to talk about some other aspects of neighborhood engagement as well. Not everybody wants to attend or participate in an official neighborhood group. As we all know, there are plenty of online outlets to engage with your neighbors. Nextdoor or Facebook groups are obviously two very common examples. There are other civic groups in neighborhoods as well, and that's not to say that that a neighborhood association is the only group that can sort of speak for a neighborhood. There are also PTAs, there are Friends of Park groups, there are business associations and merchants associations that are across the city, particularly where we have more commercial property. And then in certain areas of the city as well, we have coalitions of neighborhoods. We have the Buckhead Council of Neighborhoods, other groups that sort of come together. And then with any sort of association, we have some ad hoc groups that pop up just to deal with a particular issue. And then after that crisis or other sort of situation has moved on, then those groups might go away afterwards. So that's a basic rundown of neighborhood associations and neighborhood groups in the city of Atlanta. I'm going to pass it back to Asile to talk about the other types of groups that the city of Atlanta chooses to deal with and how they choose to function with neighborhoods. Asile?
Thank you, Kyle. So now that we've talked about neighborhoods and neighborhood associations, we're going to go one other layer up and talk about neighborhood planning units. And if you saw that NPU acronym earlier, that's what this stands for. But before we get into what NPUs are specifically, and I'll be using neighborhood planning unit and NPU interchangeably, we're going to talk about what planning is, because that's a really big, important part of the entire neighborhood scheme of decision making when we think about neighborhood power. So planning is a policy and decision-making process which guides the growth and development of your neighborhood, your city, and your region. We're not going to give you too many definitions because we know that it could get definition heavy here. But NPUs were organized in the mid-70s for the purposes of engaging residents in comprehensive planning matters that affect everybody in the livability of their neighborhoods. So there are 25 NPUs. All of them are designated by one letter of the alphabet, except for U, because that would be confusing. And there are 25 of them that make up and represent different types of neighborhoods in the city. So there are 25 of them here listed on this map. And one of the things that NPUs are to start is geographic areas. As I mentioned, NPUs make up at least 2 neighborhoods. Some of them can make up of multiple neighborhoods. This is a map here of my NPU, which is NPU-L, Vine City specifically in terms of my neighborhood, and Kyle's NPU, which is NPU-M. So we're kind of neighbors, or NPU neighbors, if you want to think about it that way. So NPUs make up of at least 2 neighborhoods across the city. And as Kyle mentioned, there are multiple neighborhoods and multiple neighborhood associations. So NPUs kind of serve as a consolidation of those for the purposes of planning matters. So that's one definition of NPUs. The other thing that NPUs are, kind of to the neighborhood definition as well, is a body of residents. And the city defines resident in this context as anybody 18 or older whose primary place of residence within the NPU or any organization, business, institution is within that NPU. So anyone can attend an NPU meeting. NPUs meet monthly and they are free and open to the public. This picture here is a picture of NPU-R, I believe at the Southwest Atlanta Festival sometime last year, back when festivals were able to happen and we missed them dearly. But this is an example of an NPU and there are 25 of them in total. So we talked about planning briefly, and I wanted to paint a picture a little bit of what planning actually looks like, because I think that it could get a little wonky and it can be used interchangeably with tons of things. So planning can be physical, and physical planning looks like things like land use, community facilities, transportation, the natural environment, city services, really the physical landscape of where we are within the city and within our neighborhoods. When we think about planning, we also think about social planning. So things like healthcare, social services, how cities are responding to community needs, the flow of money, the number of jobs. I don't know if we think of planning socially as often, but we understand these terms to be important and there are are plans that go forth in order to make sure that people are being represented accurately. And the other thing that we think about when we think of planning is economic planning. So that's where money is going, how money is flowing, the number of jobs and future employment possibilities for the city and for the neighborhood. So these are the three main buckets of planning. And if you can hear, planning is pretty important and touches all of us in some type of way, whether it's physical, social, or economic, or a combination of them all. And the most important thing that I want you to be able to walk away with here is that planning informs the Comprehensive Development Plan, also known as the CDP, which is Atlanta's guide for the growth and development of the city. The CDP states the goals and objectives of Atlanta and its citizens with the necessary policies, plans, priorities, and everything else for making sure that we attain those goals. One of the main reasons why we wanted to bring this up as well is because the city is starting to work on the next comprehensive development plan right now. So stay tuned for that if that's something that you're interested in, and understanding the overall vision for the city and how you can get involved in that decision-making process, because that is something that is about to be starting soon. So getting back to NPUs after that planning tangent, here's some of the things that NPUs vote on. So NPUs meet monthly. Of course, many of them are meeting virtually right now, as many neighborhoods are too. But one of the main things that NPUs do is vote on different matters. And they vote on things like changes to the CDP, as we mentioned, zoning issues, so changes in zoning classifications, special use permits, variances, and text amendments as well. Alcohol license applications. So if a restaurant wants to start serving beer and wine or alcohol or something like that, that is a process that goes through the NPU, as well as special events permits. We don't have as many events right now, for example, but if there's a festival going on in your area or something like that, more often than not, they would go to the NPU to talk about the event and get voted on for the special event permit. And other legislation that comes through as well, but NPUs serve as a voting body that is able to provide recommendations based on these things. The other thing that NPUs do beyond just voting is they serve as a connecting spot for other city agencies and other city departments that are going on, and other institutions in the city as well. So oftentimes at an NPU meeting, what you'll see is presentations from city departments such as the police department, the fire department, watershed management, and code enforcement. And more often than not, the NPU serves as one of the main places where that connection kind of happens between those entities, as well as elected officials. Many times an elected official like a city council person or a county commissioner would come to the NPU to give a general update for what is going on their docket with their district or whatever the case may be. And other groups like nonprofits or other organizations that are seeking public input or support. We, CCI as an organization, took a tour of all 25 neighborhood planning units last year just to say hello and to get people to know us a little bit better and understand our work. So many organizations like us go to the NPU and look to the NPU as that community connector. And as well as some other activities that NPUs choose to engage in, like community improvement and service projects, which neighborhoods do as well, just to make the point that people are able to get involved in what the future of their city and the future of their community looks like at the NPU level, as well as at the neighborhood level.
So now that Assad's told us a little bit more about NPUs, I want to talk a little bit about how the two relate to each other and how they're different from each other as well. So most NPUs do have a process for officially recognizing neighborhoods. That's typically contained in their bylaws, where they will certify a certain number or classifications for neighborhood associations or civic associations within their geographic area. Most NPUs do seek input and recommendations from those neighborhood associations before they make their own recommendations to the city. In case it wasn't clear in our previous slides or part of the discussion, the voting that the NPUs are making when they conduct their meetings, those are advisory opinions. Those are not final decision making on any of the things that they are voting on, but instead recommendations that are being submitted to the city. And as stated here, most of the time NPUs are seeking that guidance, that direction from those neighborhoods that are more directly affected by whatever that decision will be. Most NPUs do allow time on their agenda to have folks from those neighborhood associations come and speak or to discuss matters of importance to them. And some NPUs, just so you know, do have membership that's restricted to or composed only of the neighborhood associations. So as we would call them, they're either sort of boards or they are fully sort of democratic town hall style meetings. We do have both types of NPUs in the city of Atlanta. So some organizations, some NPUs, anybody can go and participate. Other ones that membership, that voting membership at least, is restricted to just the neighborhood association representatives. Now, some of the other differences, key differences between neighborhood associations and the NPUs. The neighborhood associations, as we mentioned before, were created sort of on their own. So they're there just based upon the desires of those members. If those members decide to disband the NPU or the neighborhood association, they could do that. If they chose to split in two and do something else, or form a brand new association, that's all up to them, to the members of that body. On the other hand, the neighborhood planning unit system, those were created by the city ordinance. So it would take legislative action to disband or to change the NPU. Now, if you remember back to that map we showed earlier, there aren't neighborhoods for all of the city of Atlanta. Likewise, there aren't neighborhood associations that cover all of the city of Atlanta. But there is a NPU for every piece of dirt in the city of Atlanta. The entire city is covered by some NPU. So whether you know it or not, if you live in the city of Atlanta, you are a resident of an NPU. The neighborhood associations do not have any official role in city decision making, but the neighborhood planning units do have that recommending advisory sort of position for city decision making processes that's ingrained in the system. Neighborhood associations aren't required to be open. It depends upon what their bylaws state about being subject to any sort of public participation. But in the ordinances that create the NPU system, those meetings are required to be open. So whether you've attended a meeting or not, whether it's a full body meeting, a committee meeting, whatever it happens to be, you should be able to participate in that process because as we stated earlier, you are a member of that NPU. Now for neighborhood associations, as we mentioned earlier, there are sometimes restrictions on membership. It could be that you have to be a homeowner to participate or that you have to have paid dues or something else. But for the NPU, there is no restriction on membership. There are some NPUs that do have that representative form of governance that we talked about, where only the members of that neighborhood associations that are constituent parts of that NPU get to vote. But everybody is technically a member of the NPU. And since we're here in the month of September, each of the NPUs is required to have a bylaw review in September. And at that bylaw vote, anybody and everybody who's a member of that NPU can participate. You don't have to attend a certain number of meetings. There's no dues requirement. There's no, you have to be a member of another organization. Anybody and everybody can vote on the bylaws every September across the city of Atlanta.
So now that we've talked about the neighborhood level and the NPU level, the next layer that we're going to be talking about is the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board. And if you peep, the word planning comes up again in this context, which is important. So we just wanted to give a brief definition of what APAB is, which is the acronym that I'm going to be using to describe them, and what they do and why they're important. So the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board has each NPU appoint a delegate and an alternate to represent them at APAB meetings. And APAB is the official voice of Atlanta citizens in planning as described in the city's charter, which is an awesome fun fact. And its actions and membership are subject to the city's code of ethics. APAB often advises the city concerning responsiveness of city government in general in the more broad sense, and other citizen participants in the planning, administrative, and legislative process. APAB nominates citizens for appointments to seats on numerous city boards and commissions as well, which is cool. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up with this layer and reemphasize is that each NPU appoints a delegate and an alternate to represent them in these meetings. So similar to how the NPU serves as almost a collaboration or a combination of the different neighborhoods in that part, APAB also serves as a bit of that combination between the different NPUs within the city to have a common voice or to share their opinions in a more comprehensive way. So we have some people that are involved in APAB on this panel that we're going to be talking to in just a second, but we wanted to give a brief overview of what APAB is in relation to the larger matrix of neighborhood power and neighborhood decision making. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kyle. If you know anything about CCI, you know that we love data, and we're going to be sharing some data with you on a neighborhood perspective. So I'll pass it off to Kyle.
Thanks, Asile. So as we mentioned before, the NPU system was created in the mid-1970s, but since that time there has been some changes to the state of Atlanta. You might have noticed we've grown a little bit. And this map here just shows that physically the city of Atlanta has grown some since the 1970s, but overall we're fairly much the same size as we were back when the neighborhood system was first coming into being and when the neighborhood planning system was created. But even though we're maybe technically the same physical size, the population and the demographic makeup of neighborhoods across the city has changed quite a bit. This is just an excerpt. We can't fit graphs for all 25 NPUs on this slide, but we'll be happy to share with you the full sort of chart of information. But just wanted to let you be able to see how some NPUs are much more populous than other NPUs. There are some that have very few members or residents in them, maybe less than 2,000 in some cases, whereas there are some NPUs that have up to 40,000 people living in them. And then over time, there has been changes with development, displacement, gentrification, all those things. You can see that play out in this data as well. We're not going to get into all the data because we do want to hurry up and get to the panelists and have some robust discussion with them. But if you're interested in finding out more information about a variety of topics related to NPUs, or if you're interested in council districts and other stuff that we're not going to talk about, a great website to look at is Neighborhood Nexus. And there's this particular section of the website that we've got listed here, neighborhoodnexus.org/COA _. It's hard to read that because we have an underline on our link as well. SCIR, but we'll be sure to share that in the chat and to provide a link afterwards. But you can drill down into all sorts of information there regarding jobs, regarding education, regarding gender or race or socioeconomic background, transportation. There's all sorts of data there. So please be sure to check that information out. But this stuff is really, really important. And we hope you can learn a little bit more about your neighborhood and about your neighborhood association and the NPUs as well.
So now that we've talked about like the different layers that we see on neighborhood decision making and on community engagement in general, why is all of this stuff important? After sharing definitions and all of that other stuff, we wanted to just ground in why some of this information is important and relevant. And the main thing that is important to note is that neighborhood decision making and local decision making occurs every single day of the year at the neighborhood level, at the NPU level, at the APAB level. There are residents all across the city that are showing up for their neighborhoods and for their communities every day, day in and day out, oftentimes not the most publicly or in a way that many people are unfamiliar with or whatever the case may be. But neighborhood decisions are being made nearly every day, so you don't have to wait until an opportunity to vote comes around every 4 years or until a civil unrest movement happens or something like that. This is an awesome opportunity. If you care about an issue or if you care about your community or whatever the case may be, you can show up and the opportunity is always open for you to be able to do so. So that's really important, and I think that as someone who loves Atlanta and is from Atlanta, that's something that we like to emphasize pretty often, as especially now we see that civil unrest is happening and the world around us is happening and stuff like that. So if you're interested, this is an awesome way to really get involved in the decisions that are going on in your city and how to be aware of them. Another little tip that we wanted to share as well that's more CCI specific is, as I mentioned, one of the things that CCI does is fight to end social and economic inequality in Atlanta. And for us, civic engagement and community engagement is very, very important in that process. And if you're unfamiliar with us as an organization, one of the main initiatives that we're doing is an NPU initiative, which is centered around studying the NPU system and understanding how it works, how it could be better supported. And we're going to be sharing some more information about the NPU initiative specifically, which is one of CCI's lane of focus as an organization. So if you're interested in learning more information about that or how to get involved, there are going to be many opportunities for you coming up really, really soon. So be sure to stay aware of that and to stay in touch with us if you want to learn more. So now that we've done all of that, I hope that you're super excited to get involved, and we're going to tell you some ways to be able to do that. In terms of the NPUs, find out what NPU you live in. As Kyle mentioned, everyone, whether they know it or not, in the city of Atlanta lives in an NPU. So you can check out what's happening on their agenda, what's happening in their meetings. A lot of the meetings, as I mentioned, are happening virtually, of course. So feel free to attend and join them. They are open to the public for everyone to be able to join. And a deeper layer to be able to do is read and understand their bylaws. It is bylaw season right now, so you can see some of the inner mechanics of the NPU and how they operate and how they work in that way. And if you really just fall in love with the NPUs, you can join a committee that's important to you or run for office in the NPU to be able to get involved in a deeper layer to a deeper capacity. We have some NPU officers or former NPU officers here on the call as well, and we're going to be talking to them.
So another way you can get involved is to find out what neighborhood you live in. As we mentioned, there might be a chance that you don't live in a neighborhood, and that would be awfully sad if you did live in a non-neighborhood. But presuming you do live in a neighborhood, find out which neighborhood it is, learn more about its history. One of our panelists this afternoon actually lives in a neighborhood that's older than the city of Atlanta. So some of these neighborhoods have some very interesting history. And then as we share with you that neighborhood nexus link as well, there's plenty of data out there. Learn more about your neighborhood, find out who lives there, find out the trends or the patterns. There's a lot of stuff to dig up about neighborhoods. And then if there's a neighborhood group that exists, find out more about it. If it's meeting virtually during this COVID shutdown, let's see if we can find sort of where they meet or how to get in contact with them. Maybe they're on social media. Maybe you can Google them and find them. But if there's not a neighborhood organization that represents your neighborhood, you can certainly start one. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. And we can't give you all the instructions right now on how to go about it, but we'd happy to have a discussion with you or go to an NPU meeting, speak to some neighbors there and find out how you might be able to form a new group or association to represent you and your neighbors. So we do have a few activities coming up in just the next few weeks as CCI focuses on neighborhoods for our programming. One event that we have coming up very, very soon is with the Assistant Director of the Neighborhood Planning Units for the City of Atlanta, Leah LaRue. It'll be a great conversation with her, and we look forward to discussing all things neighborhood and neighborhood planning unit system with Leah. And then we also have a special guest coming up for our community conversation towards the end of the month with Kimberly Scott, who is the current chairperson of NPUT. She has a unique perspective, and we'll hope to learn a lot more about what NPUT in particular has been up to during the COVID crisis, because it's not just been meetings, it's not been the things that we told you about before. They've been doing some interesting things to be really, really helpful to their neighbors during this time of multiple crises that have hit residents across the city.
But in the meantime, if you're interested in those events, please continue to stick with us and join us. And for now, we have some really, really awesome panelists that we're super excited to talk to who are involved in all of those layers of the neighborhood level. I have experience with them in the past. So we are going to transition now from our presentation. Thank you so much. If you have any questions about that, feel free to pose it to the panel conversation in the chat. But we're excited to talk to our panelists now who have so much experience and so much awesome perspective to share about the main topic of conversation that we're going to be discussing today, which is neighborhood power and how important that is and what we see in the landscape of neighborhood power that's important. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on over to the panelists. Hi, you guys. How is everyone?
Hey, Sal. How are you?
Doing good. I hope y'all enjoyed our presentation on neighborhood power and neighborhood decision making. What we want to start with, just for the audience, is an introduction for each of you guys, sharing a little bit about yourselves and more specifically what layer of neighborhood decision making you have experience in or involvement in and why this is important to you. So we can start with Terry. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Terry Ross, a resident of West End, Atlanta, and a active member of both the West End Neighborhood Development Organization for the neighborhood, as well as NPUT, which I was formerly chair for 4 years and held other officer positions prior to that. And to answer the question, do neighborhoods have power? Yes and no. So, but anyway, I find it ironic that I'm sitting on the CCI panel, considering that I, initially viewed CCI as a foe, and now here I am a panelist, and we've turned that one around, haven't we?
Yes,
And
we
that's
have. And thank you so much for joining us.
yeah, that's the way it should work. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Ayana, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Given the NPUT vibes, we can stay in that direction for a little bit.
Yes. Healthy competition. Hi, everyone. Ayana Gabriel. I wear a whole bunch of hats. So we'll talk about a couple of my hats. But from the neighborhood side, I am a resident of Westview, former president of Westview Community Organization. I sat on the NPUT. At some point, Terry and I, we crossed paths sitting on the NPUT executive committee. And I would say my neighborhood work and part of my story is it led me to other neighborhood related leadership positions. And so I currently am a senior program officer at the Blank Family Foundation. I tell people I get to do grant making in my neighborhood, given that I live on the west side. And I am also your city council appointed community representative for the Atlanta Beltline, because I am in that seat. And so if you have any Beltline questions, you could ask me. And I've been on the board of the Beltline for about 3 years now and have a lot of perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely going to get into that and the partnerships that neighborhoods have with different entities like the Beltline, for example, and what neighborhood power looks like in that respect. But we'll get into it. Jerry, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Jerry Newmark. I teach at Georgia State University. I started out as just a neighborhood person starting to attend my neighborhood NPUF. Somehow or another, it got worked up to be vice president and then delegate to APAB. I was executive vice or first vice president of APAB for about 3 or 4 years, and the shortest reigning president ever of APAB. Currently, a couple things that I think are fairly important. I'm former this and former that because I am the APAB representative to what used to be the ethics board is now the IG board. So I had to completely back off of any kind of politics, including anything having to do with the NPU and APAB, and stay completely neutral because, as you said in your slides, they are part of the ethics code. So anything that's part of the ethics code, I have to be totally neutral about. The other thing is I'm very interested in neighborhood power, always have been. My whole career in political science has been about neighborhood power. And I love the whole concept of the NPU and neighborhood power. And I've had my students for years study the NPU. Asal and Kyle are both aware of some of the studying, not so much because of they're going to come up with these new brilliant ideas, but they really have the good ideas the students have come up with, but to sort of teach them that it exists and maybe spread the whole concept of NPUs beyond Atlanta. And as a matter of fact, I had one student who tried to start an NPU system in the city of Douglasville until she was shot down by city council, which speaks very well to our NPU, by the way. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Katie, do you want to give an introduction and tell us about yourself?
Sure. My name is Katie Kissel. I am the current president of the Kirkwood Neighbors Organization. And I also wear a couple different hats. I also sit on the executive board of Helping Empower Youth, which is an organization that's working with the Water Boys here in Atlanta, among other things. And one of the founding board members of the Integrated Schools Atlanta chapter here, for anyone who is familiar with that organization. Which kind of speaks to the fact that I have 2 small children, Gus, age 6, who goes to Toomer Elementary, our local Atlanta public school, and my daughter Charlie, age 3. And my husband and I have lived here in Kirkwood. We've lived in the city of Atlanta for 8 years, and this is our 7th year in Kirkwood. So yeah, I really, really have enjoyed my neighborhood, and learning about Atlanta's amazing and unique NPU system and neighborhood system, I think is what makes Atlanta, one of the many things that makes Atlanta such a great city to live.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. Kyle and I both have been in Atlanta for a very, very long time, and we heart Atlanta. Atlanta influences everything, all that good stuff. I'm so excited. I'm sorry. I think that this is a conversation that we have internally, as I mentioned with you guys before, all the time. But to be able to really share what the importance of neighborhood power is pretty dope. So I'm excited about that. Are you excited, Kyle?
Yes, of course I'm excited. This is what we talk about all day, any day anyway, so we might as well talk about it with other people. What we would like to start off asking a question before we get to Terry's sort of response about, do we have, not enough power with the neighborhoods, but we've obviously presented a little bit about why we think some of this decision-making is important and why we have neighborhood involvement and how those neighbors have got involved. But we'd love to hear a little bit maybe about how each of you maybe personally got involved in your neighborhood and why you think getting involved was important for you personally. Whoever wants to sort of start with that one. But we've given a little bit of sort of background, but let's go back to Terry just to start with. Terry, what got you involved in your neighborhood in the first place?
Sure. Well, Carla, I bought a place over here in the West End 12 years ago. And I would often sit on my front porch, big southern front porch that I have, and just watch my neighbors and residents around me, and saw that there were some inequities that I felt like were unacceptable. And how do we get, and I wanted to figure out how do we go about instituting those changes. And then I found out we had a neighborhood organization, and that the city of Atlanta had an NPU process. And it's like, what a blessing. And, the first NPU meeting I went to, I was nominated as secretary.
I think that's a fairly common story.
That's about what happens. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so it just went from there. One thing I didn't mention in my introduction is that I did work on the design team of the Atlanta Community Engagement Playbook. Which I consider another jewel for residents as well as government officials here in the city of Atlanta. That thing really works, and I saw that CCI included it in their slide presentation, some of the pages from the book. But anyway, that's what got me started, Kyle.
Yeah, when we said get involved on our slide and maybe run for office, that wasn't you having the option of running for office, but yes, if you show up for these meetings, there will be people who want you to get involved at a deeper level, joining a committee or participating somehow. But I think that speaks to the richness of the folks that live in Atlanta, that we've got such a deep bench of folks who have such a broad skill set to participate that, we can definitely use your help, but we'd love to see as many people get engaged in these processes as possible. So we'll switch up the order this time a little bit. So Katie, how did you said you moved to Atlanta 8 years ago and been in Kirkwood for about 7, but what got you, how did you find out about your neighborhood and how did you get involved with them in the first place?
Atlanta is a funny place. The reason I was living in Old Fourth Ward, and the reason I even looked at Kirkwood is because I'd happened to run into somebody who said, hey, you're looking to buy a house. Of course, by the time I was there, Old Fourth Ward, even though Ponce City Market wasn't there yet, and they'd already been pricing it like Ponce City Market was there, I tell you. So my husband and I, we ended up at Kirkwood, and the realtor who happened to be the listing realtor on our house was a former president of our neighborhood organization. My husband and I decided to go because we were grown-ups who hadn't made a whole lot of friends yet. And I am a habitual overachiever. So it was not very long, kind of like with Terry, before the president approached me and said, hey, you should be chair of the public safety committee. I need one of those. And here I am.
Yeah, the rest is history. Awesome. Ayana, what's your story? How did you first get connected with your neighborhood?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I got so many stories. That's the fun part about neighborhood work. You have so many stories. So I'll start a little bit about my Atlanta part. I came to Atlanta in 1995 to attend Spelman. So I've been here a long time, the year before Olympics, and seen a whole lot of change. And so I was always familiar with the West End. And when I started looking for a house, I was a teacher in my late 20s, and I started on the East Side, and honestly, I couldn't afford it. And so then I came back to the West End, and I couldn't afford West End. So I ended up in this area that I thought was West End, and I was looking for houses, and I couldn't afford a 3-2, so I was down to a 3-1. And I came and looked at what is my house, and there was a door knocker hanging, and it said Anoda Park Beltline Planning Meeting. And this is 2006, I should say. I moved into Westview in 2006, high in the market. And I was like, what's the Beltline? And so then I went online and I looked it up, and I called my realtor, and I was like, I'm gonna send you a map, and I only want you to look at houses on this circle. And she was like, what? I was like, just trust me. And so that is how I first got involved. Now I'm on the Beltline board, so it's ironic. And so I always tell the community group, I was like, yes, door-to-door works. If you did not have that door knocker, which was their door-to-door community engagement, like I can tell you, neighborhood work has been life transformation for me. It has been the best leadership experience of my life. And so I was like, yes, please put more money in the community engagement budget. I can tell you why this works. And so then my very first time I got involved, I hadn't even moved into the neighborhood yet. I was like, well, I'm gonna go to this Anoda Park planning meeting. And I just remember sitting there, and most of the people had lived in the neighborhood in the 40s and 50s. They had come in their 60s, elders. And then there was like one couple who had moved in at like 2002, and then there was me. And the thing that I remember is we were designing the park, and I remember getting this conversation about how people said we couldn't have a basketball court. And people were using all these euphemisms, and they're like, well, you know, that element and the kids, and you know, maybe we put a fence around it. And at that time I was teaching high school. I'm like 28. And I was like, you want to put a fence around basketball court? I was like, but we're in West End. And I just remember thinking, I'm the only person at this table who's advocating for kids, because we were about to have a dog park or something. It's like, it's West End, the kids in the street. And now that park still isn't built. That's another story. It's going to be $10 million. It's gone through a design. But, you know, that was like my first like aha of like, wait, there are 6 people at this table. We are planning what's about to be a $10 million park, and nobody here is representing kids, and they want to put an iron rod fence around the basketball court if we have a basketball court. They're like, what about tennis court? And so, as you probably can tell, that was my first foray. I was like, I need to get involved.
Well, we now understand why you went back to a second meeting, because you definitely felt some passion about what you encountered at your first meeting. Yeah. So Jerry, what was your entree? Who knocked on your door to get you involved in the NPU system or the neighborhood association?
I also have a connection with the Beltline. What had happened was, before I came to Georgia State, I was teaching at Central Michigan University, and one day I received one of these nasty little letters saying, how come you have not published? And so I just said, better come up with the subject. And it was about the time that the Beltline was just getting off the ground. So in order to do research and begin knowing more about the Beltline, I realized some of you know Liz Coyle, and Liz was the vice chair of NPUF, but she was also very active in the Beltline. So I sort of connected with her as beginning research. And she got me interested in the NPU, and that's how I started, you know, getting into the NPU. And as I said when I introduced myself, the rest is sort of like history. I kind of worked myself up into more of an executive position eventually, and into APAT. Yeah,
you ended up working yourself out of those positions because you took an appointment to a body that has to from these bodies.
It was a tough decision in many ways, because in the last few years, the chair of APAP, who's still the chair, Debbie Skipczynski, and I would meet. She was also the president of the NPU. And so she and I would meet once every couple of weeks and talk about NPU matters and, you know, and exchange ideas. And it was Debbie who first suggested that there was an opening from APAB onto the ethics board. And one of the first things that I was told in no uncertain terms is, well, you can't do this anymore. You can't be, vice this or whatever position I held. So it was a tough decision, but I felt that I was going to serve the city, better by being on the ethics board. So I sort of gave it up. So that's how, it's not that I purposely wanted to work my way out of all of this. It was more or less I had to.
So one of the things that I think is important in thinking about neighborhood power, and each of you in your own introductions kind of touched on this, is humanizing the work and humanizing how important this like role that a lot of you guys have voluntarily taken on and have taken on in the past is. In our experience and talking to neighborhood leaders and NPU leaders, it's very heavy work sometimes, like we all love Atlanta, we all care about it and want to see it live up to its full potential, and oftentimes there aren't many wins there, and I find that in thinking about why neighborhood power is important, I think it's important to highlight some of those success stories, and being involved in the neighborhood and being involved in, what neighborhood power can look like. I think when we went to go visit NPU meetings, for example, we heard incredible stories about like neighborhoods putting together senior lawn care programs to make sure that people were getting their lawns mowed by residents, or, we've seen food at NPU meetings if people are hungry, and the meetings at 7 o'clock at night, and that, little stuff I think that really shows the breadth of what neighborhood power is and what the importance of neighborhoods are. So one question that I have is like, what success story, or do you have stories that you remember like that reminded you, yes, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, or yes, this is what my work is about? I think that those are important, and I don't know if those get heard as often because we're so in the weeds all the time with the work itself. So Katie, I hear you kind of nodding and thinking about an example. Do you want to go ahead and share?
Yes, I have multiple examples. I'm going to pick the one that's probably the most important to me right now in the work that I do. So becoming neighborhood president, I began the beginning of this year. So we had January, February, and then March we had COVID. And then not long after COVID, we had the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And, the reason when I took over this position, the number one thing, I had a couple things I wanted to accomplish, but the number one thing I wanted to accomplish was to address the inequities in our organization. And it wasn't necessarily, it was reflected in the neighborhood, but you could see it very specifically in our organization. Kirkwood is a rapidly gentrifying part of Atlanta. If I were to move here today, I couldn't afford it. And when I started at the neighborhood level, you could tell that the neighborhood organization was not racially reflective of the neighborhood population. But then by the time I became president, there were very few to no Black people who were attending Kirkwood neighborhood organization meetings. Our board was entirely white. Almost every leadership position we have a committee for transportation, outreach, parks and environmental, Kirkwood Cares, Kirkwood Adopt a Senior Program, arts and beautification, public safety, spring fling/events, zoning, education, and NPU representative. And none of those people, when I started, were Black. And it's a problem. So what did I do? I met with our city councilwoman right after I took it over as president and said, this is a problem, I'm going to try and address it. And she said, well, good luck. If you can help, if you can do this, you can probably do anything. And I said, this is what I want to do. And we started by saying, like, no more, we're going to change this, that this is a problem. And if there is anything and reaching out to our neighbors and saying, what about neighborhood organization meetings? Why don't you come? And what has your experience been like? And what can we do to make it different? And I had a very good friend and former president who I basically revived what was a dead committee, which was our outreach committee. And her name is Tina Davis, and she is also a Spelman grad. So yes. And she works. She had also been a professor at Morehouse and a former president of Kirkwood Neighbors Organization. And I said, "Will you help me?" And we began this partnership. And now I can say that when we have been 100% virtual since our April meeting, and our plan is to continue some virtual element long beyond COVID. And we have a laundry list of things that we're doing, but our meetings right now are more reflective of the neighborhood demographic than they've ever been, even started when I first started. So I'm very happy and very proud of that fact, and I still got a lot of work to do, but.
Awesome. Congrats.
I love it. And I think that thinking about, neighborhood power can be so specific and so broad, right? Like not only neighborhood power in like serving as a voice to city decision makers or like in changing legislation or whatever, but also the power that neighborhoods have internally, right? To be able to make decisions or make calls or make choices or whatever is equally as important, right? Because neighborhoods are with neighbors and with people, and that's important. And I think in thinking about humanizing this work, that's a piece of it, like these are all people and people that are a part of this overall like landscape. So I love
If I could just follow up with one short comment that I have noticed specifically is it's within the individual neighborhood, the people who are controlling the neighborhood organizations. And while, I'm sure we'll talk about this, while neighborhood organizations have no power officially, they have all the power unofficially. Our NPU is made up of 3 strong neighborhood organizations. They defer to the neighborhood organizations almost 100% of the time on their votes. So we do have all the power. We have the ear of every single representative. And it is in the self-interest of the people who are controlling that neighborhood organization to concentrate that power and to have less people at the table. And, you have to have somebody who is passionate about bringing, not just about your own personal needs, but the entire neighborhood needs in order to change the dynamic. So.
Absolutely.
I see people unmuting themselves, so I wanted to make space before I move on to the next question if anyone wants to add or comment or share their own experience with that.
Well, I wanted to add a sound. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Terry. No, go ahead, Terry, because I want to share a story on that.
And I'll keep it brief. I was just going to say with any organization, no matter what or the size, the most valuable asset of that organization is the people and the networks that they bring with them to the table. And so that's something that's even more reason to be open to any and all stakeholders.
And Asal, mine's a story about the best time I see neighborhood power, but I think we've stuffed it in. So I don't want to hold it up because it would take a couple minutes to say it if we want to move on. If we have time, I would share the story.
I'm sure it may come up again because I find that some of the conversation might be cyclical, right? And I love that so much of this is resonating. There are very few opportunities, especially now with COVID, to be able to share across neighborhood lines and NPU lines and all that other stuff. So this is great. I wanted to turn it over to talk a little bit more with some of those successes, like what challenges you may have faced like in these neighborhood roles or like thinking about neighborhood power and what that looks like. Jerry, I know that in your experience, you as a professor, send students out to NPUs to engage in the NPU, and just for that youth perspective, but also to understand their perspective of NPUs, which is different sometimes from people who are involved in the NPUs every day, all the time. What has been some of your experience with that, and what have you noticed?
Well, I think it's really been refreshing to see my students be involved in the NPU, because they're looking at it from an untrained eye, which is sometimes the best way you can possibly look at something. And they're fascinated with it to begin with. There's, in the years I've been doing this, there has never been an unfavorable overall view of an NPU. And as I said, I've even had students attempt to try to develop an NPU system. I've had several students over the years become involved with their NPU. And as a matter of fact, Kyle, one of my former students, was secretary of MPUM for a while. So they were motivated to look at the whole concept of an NPU. There were things they were concerned about, though. And across the board, and I'm concerned about this too. I still attend the NPU, even though I can't have an official part of it. I think the biggest concern is the fact that, and I don't know if it's true of your NPUs, but at least with NPUF, the average age must be about 70 or 80. And I'm being a little bit facetious, but there are very few younger people. The only time, at least in NPUF, that you're going to have younger people, and these are the 30-somethings, will show up if there's a land use issue. Other than that, they don't show up, they don't participate. Very, very few young people participate in the NPUs, and I don't know if that's true about T, for example, or although I do get the impression that M may have a few more younger people. They're the future of the NPU, and there's got to be a way of exciting them. That's sort of one of the reasons I've sent my students out to look at the NPU system. How are we going to get these young people to be excited about that they hold the future in their hands? And so that's one of the perspectives they have. They're very much into the technical stuff. Why don't we have more online, or why don't we have more social media type stuff and emanating out of the NPU? A lot of that has come out over the years. So that's another perspective they have on the NPU. But overall, they're extremely positive. The problem is, how do we get them to transition from this real positive view to being involved? The real action is when you're involved in the NPU. I don't know if this is switching gears or not, but it's something that occurred to me when I was thinking about this session. And I'm going to make sort of I guess maybe a controversial, but that's what we do in university, controversial type of statements, and then let our students disagree or agree. I just wonder, this is sort of a mind game. I just wonder if, when we're seeing the social unrest, and we know the linchpin of the social unrest has been the murders of young Black males. But that being said, I just wonder if all these cities that are seeing the social unrest, and there's an awful lot of them, some that don't even make the news, if they would have had a system years ago in place where the neighborhoods really had power, where the neighborhoods really were involved in the policy-making process, if instead of some of the anger that we're seeing, and the anger is definitely justified, but if we would have seen more engagement over the last several weeks or months, as opposed to just plain anger. It's just a mind game. I don't know. And I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to maybe comment on that. How do you feel about that?
Well, Jerry, I'd like to address that. You know, we are so fortunate in Atlanta to have the NPU process. There's already a framework for community engagement, civic engagement, resident engagement. However, unfortunately, it is being underutilized and receiving an inadequate amount of support from the city government itself. If you recall, Gary, we also had civil unrest here in the streets of Atlanta, and there was that level of anger was here in the streets of Atlanta. If Atlanta wasn't leading the nation, actually, and even though we had the NPU process in place, that wasn't good enough, and part of it was because a lot of people weren't even aware of it, didn't even know that that existed or that path was available to them. And so that's how I would answer that, Jerry, that there would still be civil unrest even with this process. We just have to expand this NPU process so that we can engage all residents.
And I didn't suggest that the NPU was the, would have prevented this kind of thing at all. I'm suggesting that, if these cities would have encouraged their neighborhoods to really be involved in the policy-making process, what difference it would have made. And I agree with you, Terry. Atlanta has not done nearly enough to really engage the neighborhoods. One of the frustrations, and maybe one of the reasons I left the presidency of APAD, probably the primary reason, was this tremendous lack of support that I was getting from the planning department, from the city. Here I was, president of a major organization and got virtually no support. I couldn't even pick up the phone and telephone at that time the planning commissioner or the person who was in charge of the NPU. They wouldn't return calls, for example. And that was it. I mean, my time was very precious to me, and I just didn't have the patience to run this organization when I was not getting support from the cities. Can't agree with you more about the lack of support. So throughout the question, it was a mind game, as I said. What if, it's a what if question, these cities really would have given their support to the neighborhoods, Atlanta included? Would that have made a difference in terms of constructive engagement when we see tragedy?
And to answer that, okay.
I would love to get some thoughts here that I think I want to give I want to give a framing of how I think about neighborhood work, and I'm also conscious of time, so I'll try to be really quick. Katie just gets to a lot of the stuff, and I see you pop in. I was like, Katie, I feel like we would probably have a lot of things to talk about. Kirkwood and Westview are kind of alike, right? So when I say that neighborhood work was life transformation, I mean it. I learned how to be an organizer. And neighborhood work led me to organizing training. And so, Jared, when I think about what you think about, what I learned in the one organizing training I went to, but then we organized, is that, this is all about power. And if you have organized people, you have organized money. My full-time job happens to be the organized money side, but my neighborhood work was on the organized people side. And so I think the reason I think the NPUs are so powerful, Maynard Jackson was brilliant in many different ways, not just the airport, was that he realized as Atlanta was going through this transition, and I speak openly about race, we're gonna talk about gentrification in a second, that where you were for the first time in Atlanta having Black leadership despite the demographics of the city, is that you had to have some way to get the organized people. And so on one hand, I do agree with you, Jerry, and Terry, that I think if people could understand, I haven't read anything on this, and I would say the other thing I have to say is most of the stuff I've learned about Atlanta and neighborhood stuff has been from talking to people and the elders. So for anybody who's on this call, sit and talk to the old people in this neighborhood. They know all the tea and dirt. I mean, I remember when Kasim Reed was doing stuff in my neighborhood down the street. He was like, I know that boy's mama. I can't believe he's letting them churches get teared down. I mean, when I was doing the Noda Park organizing, and we were trying to get some legislation for eminent domain, I sat on the porch of a 94-year-old woman in my neighborhood, And she, you know, old people like, well, I want to talk to you, baby. I was like, I don't have time, but I'm about to make time. And she told me how so many of the neighbors moved to our side of the neighborhood because MARTA went through their neighborhood and took their house. And then she's like, I'm going to sign this, but you just be careful about what they do. So that's one thing I would say. If you want to learn about what happened in the city, just talk to elderly people in the city. Like, they personally know these people. Maynard Jackson used to live in my neighborhood. So they know everything. They know everything. And so I think that is the power of the NPUs. And I do believe in organizing. As you probably can tell, I believe in radical organizing. I believe that you do have to put pressure because people do not change unless you put pressure on them. And we have a structure already set up for us to do that. And just to close out in terms of what Katie was talking about, when I realized that, Jerry, is that I would tell, when I became president, I told my executive committee, I was like, I'm not interested in being president of the gardening club. The Beltline runs through our neighborhood. This is 2010. We just had gone through the recession. We have the stadium that's supposed to be built. I don't know anything about it. And this is way before I got the Blake, 10 minutes away from, you know, we have Westside Park on the other side. It's going to be 3 times bigger than Piedmont Park. We got Emerald Corridor over here in Grove Park. I was like, we are sitting in the middle of everything. And if we can see the monster on the hill coming, and if we don't get ourselves together, we will get run over. We still got run over. But it was about power. And it was about getting the people power. And that is what motivated us. That is what we have organized several times. We own land in our neighborhood now from organizing. And so I just want to put that lens in terms of, to me, how we should be thinking about this, particularly given that this is hosted by CCI.
I have a kind of a comment to feed off of that, organizing in power and money in power. And this is where I will go back to the neighborhood organizations have no power and they have all the power dynamic. And the NPUs don't have money, at least that I'm not aware of. I don't think they're 501. Kirkwood Neighbors Organization is a 501c3. We host a 100% volunteer run, well, in non-COVID times, a 100% volunteer run event every year called the Kirkwood Spring Fling. We bring in $60,000. In addition to that, we raise for our individual, we have Kirkwood Cares, which is helping displaced or helping prevent seniors, low-income seniors from being displaced by making critical repairs to their home. They do their own fundraising. We have Kirkwood Adopt a Senior program, which helps, they do their own fundraising. So because of the money side of it, that's why neighborhood organizations have so much more power, at least in our neighborhood organization, because I can actually spend the money. I can write a check and do something about it. And then I don't have to go to the NPU meeting and sit there and listen to some people who've been around for a very long time spend like 30 minutes talking about something that maybe doesn't matter to me. And I don't have to listen to 4 different police officers from 4 different departments talk about the Clean Guard campaign, because that don't matter to me. What matters to me mostly is at my neighborhood level. So I just want to add that that's another thing that neighborhoods might have that NPUs don't, is that money piece.
Yeah, Katie, I could.
What were you saying? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like to hear from Terry. I'm sorry, because no offense. Hey, Terry, he's got NPUT, and I've heard all the things. Terry and Ayana, people talk about NPUT. Listen, I'm here to tell you, they've talked about NPUT.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, I hear that.
They do. They're like, check out this NPUT, man. They got it going on over there.
Shout out Weston, shout out Terry.
Yeah, absolutely. T. Yeah. Yeah, but and just to expand on what you were saying, Katie, that's the brilliance of the NPU process, is that it's a bottoms up system. And so you have the neighborhood organizations, which should give lead to the NPUs. The NPUs carry that. to the city council and the city boards. Anyway, Jerry, she wanted to hear from you.
Yeah, no.
Well, I was just going to say, what I hear you saying is, in lieu of cooperation, organization, one of the word trumps cooperative, but I'm not going to say that. Organization overpowers lack of cooperation. So even though we may not be getting this cooperation, you know, good organization is still going to drive the neighborhood movement in Atlanta.
And I think kind of to piggyback off of that, you know, as CCI is involved in this NPU initiative and interested in like how the NPU sit in this larger matrix that I think that we're talking about, you know, there is no one size fits all solution, right? Like it sounds like depending on like, this is such an important matrix and all of these issues are connected to one another. Like what neighborhood power looks like is not just a neighborhood is able to sign a check and get something done. It also requires everything else from the bottom up, kind of that Terry is talking about as well. And the beauty of the NPU system in my mind is like the intentionality behind how that was set up, you know, like Ayana's point about the fact that there are people that are still around that knew Maynard and live next to Maynard and all types of stuff, you know, like we don't have to reinvent the wheel and thinking about what the potential of this system can be a lot of the time, you know, because there are people and organizers in history's past, and I can go on a huge tangent about that, you know, that talked about like what the importance of neighborhood power is. I mean, even when the NPUs were created, that was off of the impetus of community organizing with the railroads and the trains going through communities and all types of stuff like that. Catalyst always starts, well, not always, but can start from unrest a lot of the time, you know, and in times like now, I think that's another really important parallel. Like we are in a time of unrest at the moment, but in history, we have seen that that could be the catalyst for organizing and movement building and something like the NPUs to be able to come out of that, which is miraculous. And even when we're studying it at CCI, we read articles from the 70s and they're like, Jesus Christ, they were thinking about that stuff. Then here we are now trying to do the same thing. How do we do that? You know, which is awesome. And I know inspires us in our work all the time and making sure that we're rooted in that and also seeing kind of to Terry's point earlier, the potential of what this could be if all of that support was fully unlocked and what that looks like, because it's there and the tools are there, but they're just locked away right now, you know, and don't necessarily have the support or capacity or funding or whatever it is. That's a lot of what we're trying to figure out to see like, okay, how can we have this live up to its fullest potential, which we know it can, and what does that mean beyond just neighborhood decisions, but for civil unrest movements like the police and you know, so on and so forth. Like, what does that look like as a foundation that many cities don't have, and we do, you know? So how do we work with that and go from there? So that's my own personal tangent there, but
yeah. Thanks, Asel. We have had some questions sort of come through from the chat, so just wanted to make sure that we can vocalize some of those, particularly regarding challenges that the system faces, both the neighborhoods themselves as well as the neighborhood planning unit system. We've obviously discussed some of them, but to a degree, if we can just talk a little bit more about, Katie, you mentioned trying to make sure that your neighborhood organization was representative of that broader community, something we haven't explicitly stated, but in the NPU legislation, there's a requirement that those NPU bodies are representative of those geographies. So obviously it's a struggle,
Really?
It can be a struggle. Well, it's
Sorry,
not to say
I didn't know that because they are not.
well,
I don't play poker, y'all. So my face is telling you all the things.
so we can all debate whether or not folks have been held accountable to those standards, right? But there is, and I think this is what's come up through the chat as well. People have been concerned about organizations of whatever kind, right? A neighborhood organization that is exclusive and I don't want to pay dues, I can't be involved in that, versus a neighborhood or an NPU system where maybe the people in the room don't look like me at all, or they there's no renter in the room, everybody's a homeowner and they're speaking about homeowners' interest. And you know, if we look at the demographics of the city as a whole, it's about 50-50 renters versus homeowners. So curious, just sort of y'all's thoughts on what those challenges are and how we might address them, whether that's, you know, holding each other accountable, I think, but as well as providing resources and tools, whether that's funding, training, technical support, whatever, to address those inequities that we have across any system in Atlanta. This is not exclusive to neighborhood associations or to the NPUs. But how are we addressing some of those challenges, or how can we address those challenges?
Well, absolutely, Kyle. I mean, Ayana touched on it a couple of times today. My leadership skills got so honed and refined from getting involved in this community work. And good leadership means that you care about the folks that you're leading. That's exactly what it means. Leadership in this context is serving the community. And if you come from that perspective, then you have the qualities to become a good leader. I just saw why Keisha asked a question about the youth. Do the youth know? And, you know, when we were designing the playbook, that's exactly what we were talking about. Community engagement. You cannot have conversations about areas or people without having the people or the representatives from those areas at the table as well. If you don't get input from them, then you're stepping out of your lane to make decisions that will directly impact them. And that's the antithesis of community engagement. And so, but unfortunately, that has been the model that's been practiced for so many years. And, you know, at MPUT, we regularly get folks coming to the table saying, hey, this is what we're going to do for you guys, and you guys are going to love it, you know. And, you know, we counter with, well, that's not what we want. That's not what we need. And who are you? We didn't ask for this anyway. So
many opinions.
I'll be real quick. Oh, no, go ahead, Katie. Go ahead.
No, please, Ayana, please.
I would just say, and this gets to, I think, the thread about who has power and stuff. I would say that, yes, I don't know if it's 50-50. A lot of neighborhood association MPUs are used in the wrong way. I have never in my life seen, I think it's because there's no boundaries of professional settings, the level of A-type control personalities that you get into community work. What I would say is I think it's really important to get a coalition of the willing of people who are there for the people, as Terry says. And sometimes you got to take your neighborhood association back, and then you have to protect it. And so when I became president, I tried to do the same thing, Katie, that you're doing now. It wasn't necessarily, we had a good mixed racial group, but we didn't have any renters. In the 2010 census, 60% of our neighborhood are homeowners, 40% are renters. And so concretely, I told the executive board, I was like, we need to match these demographics. And so we had renters come on for the first time. You know, they were running committees, they were getting budgets. We had people, I was like, a lot of people in Section 8, we had that. And all kind of stuff started happening because all of these folks who said that they were like, oh, kumbaya, when they actually had to share power with the people who were renters, it was interesting. And I remember this moment where people were having all this conversation about Section 8, Section 8, Section 8. And one of the people on my executive committee paused, and he was like, well, I'm one of the people who has the privilege of getting a Section 8 voucher. And Section 8 never came up again in the many years that I had it. And I was like, that's the difference with the persons in the room. Yep. It's different, but now they're sitting across from you, and like literally it never came up again. And so I would say that there are a lot of places where people are not, as Katie and Terry is doing it right, like, hey, you have to take it back, and you have to be unapologetic about it, and it will get ugly, but you really do. And I think that is the bad side of the MPUs, because it does have power.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's one of the things I think that CCI is trying to do. I mean, you obviously were able to check the census data yourself. And if you haven't filled out your census form, please be sure to fill out your census form, be counted, so we know that you're here and we can account for you. But to make sure that neighborhoods know that demographic, that they know the number of renters or the number of students, Terry, you know, who are the AUC, you know, these things matter. And if they're not in the room, if they're not part of the conversation, it's easy to dismiss their voice. But we need to understand that even though those people can't show up on a Tuesday night or haven't jumped on our Zoom call, that those folks are still members. They're still our fellow neighbors. They're still residents of the city of Atlanta, of our neighborhood. Maybe they might not belong to our association yet, but that doesn't mean we can't invite them or we can't get them involved in some way. So thank you for all your comments. Asad, do you want to ask another question?
Sure. I think that one of the things that CCI is interested in, kind of Ayana's point that she kind of touched on, was like the importance of that data and even being able to track that and understand, okay, we have this amount of people, we have this amount of people, that's not being represented. How do we do that? And for context, for some of you that already know that, I know, Terry, we've had numerous conversations about the NPU initiative and what our goals are with that. But one of the things, kind of to Kyle's point, that we want to be able to do is equip people with some of that data on the NPU or even neighborhood level to say, here are some of the issues, here are some of the concerns, here's what's happening. And to collaboratively be able to understand what we want to do with that information. And over the past year and a half, even we internally have learned so much about the NPUs and about neighborhood decision making. And I'm personally so excited for some of that data, which I think is going to be pretty groundbreaking and some of the first information in that way in a really long time, even down to where an application goes after it leaves the NPU, what happens, what's going on. We're trying to figure a lot of that out. And always get feedback and collaboration along the way and trying to figure out how to make this work, you know, and to live up to its full potential. So one final question I think that I want to be able to ask is, like, more generally, we've been talking about involvement and what that looks like. So what would you guys recommend as a way to get involved in this work, or what that looks like, or based on your perspective of what involvement looked like for you? What does that mean to you, like being involved in these community conversations, and how do people do it from your own perspectives, either through the neighborhood work directly or academically? We had our own perspective to just look it up and find a neighborhood, you know, and like go from there. But what does that look like from your perspective for people, maybe participants or people who watch this later, who want to get involved in this way?
Well, go ahead, Katie. Go ahead, Katie. Go ahead. Ladies first.
Oh, thank you. Chivalry is not dead. No, I would like to kind of turn that question around a little bit, and say, you know, I mean, I know that the people on here, a lot of them maybe are interested in getting involved, and we're trying to talk to them about how to get involved. I mean, the internet is available. Like, people know, if they know about it and want to, they can get involved if they're able, right? But the thing is that we have to recognize is that every person sitting here who has been involved has a certain level of privilege in the fact that we have been able to make 7 o'clock meetings. We have had the free time. We aren't working 3 jobs, and, you know, don't have to worry about childcare and all these barriers that are preventing people from being involved. Like, some people don't have the time, the free time to just give. And so we are ultimately excluding people by default. So I would say the thing is that we need to talk about is, how do we lessen those barriers to allow people to be more included, and to then ultimately give you, you know, I want NPUs to have more power, and I want neighborhoods to have more power, but I want them to have power that's representative of the neighborhood. And the only way we can do that is if we put our money in providing these services.
Yeah, Katie, I couldn't agree more. And I want to reference the Atlanta Community Engagement Playbook. When we designed that thing back in 2015, 2016, those are the exact conversations we had. The barrier. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay.
Oh yeah, I can. I was just saying I want a copy. I want a physical copy that I can show around.
And actually, there's a PDF copy online at ourcommunity.is/engaged. Okay, ourcommunity.is/engaged. But that's one of the things that we talked about, the barriers for community and civic engagement. And over 30% of the households in the city of Atlanta are single parent homes. So at 6, 7 p.m., it's dinner time. It's picking up from daycare. It's homework time, much less a neighborhood meeting or a community meeting. I don't think so when it comes to the list of priorities. And then there's a whole population that is actually working during those hours. And those are the hours that they work. Our travel industry was huge here. And so a lot of folks have those 4 to 11 shifts, and they're not going to make the 7 p.m. community meetings as well. So all of those things have to be considered. And I saw that someone had asked the question, how many neighborhoods are there in Atlanta? And the last count that I had from the city of planning was 324 neighborhoods. And so it makes it difficult for legislation to cover the entire city of Atlanta because every neighborhood has their own individual characteristics and things like that. But yeah, there has to be intentional community and civic engagement. And quite honestly, I don't think we've seen it even come close to the potential that it can.
I'd like to see we continue with Zoom when this whole pandemic is finished, that neighborhood meetings as well as NPU meetings continue Zooming, because you're right, not everybody can get down to the local community center or church to get to a meeting, but you can sit in front of a computer and watch what's going on. It's not the be all, as you say, Terry. Some people have to work and take care of dinner and all that, but I think just Zooming the meetings will add a whole new element to those people who are now able to come to the meetings.
Absolutely, Gary. And you know, it's so ironic because 2 years ago, we talked about doing NPU meetings online and remotely, right? And we were told, no way, no how, right? I mean, the city charter was quoted to us as being a reason we couldn't do it, as well as numerous reasons. Well, you know, this is a silver lining to Corona or COVID-19. Look at us now.
Yeah.
We had huge opposition in our neighborhood, huge opposition to going online and I basically said, it's COVID, y'all. This was before we knew what COVID was going to be. And I said, we are not going to stop our meetings. And I'm so glad that we made that decision.
Absolutely. And you know, Ayana's neighborhood, Westview, they actually went remote early in 2019. And so they were already on the saddle and riding just fine. And as far as them being part of NPUT, they were basically our test tube babies of how we could all get there. But Corona sped that up. So,
Ayana, any final words about your perspective on this before we close out?
No, I just agree with what everybody says. As you probably can tell, I love community work. Oh, here's what I will say. Sorry. So if you notice, I think Terry keeps on saying what used to do okay, neighborhood work is a grind. It is a grind, right? And so I started like really doing stuff around 2008. And I personally had to step away around 2015. My mom passed. There was just a lot going on. So I would say, please give your permission to take care of yourself. Sometimes I see people in the neighborhood, they're like, you still live here? They're like, I don't know, it was the last time I saw Terry. So I went hard. I went hard for 8 to 8 years. But what I will say is transitioned. I mean, just to be honest, I work at the Blank Family Foundation. I sit on the board of the Beltline. I cannot do the stuff I did. I'm very cognizant that this is being recorded. And so, you can take care of yourself. I guess I'm saying two things. And then there is a time to transition. There's a time to transition. And, I can tell you the 3 presidents who came after me, including the current president, is amazing. It's absolutely amazing because now I play a different role. But please take care of yourself because it is a grind. It is a grind, especially when you become president. Katie, good luck. Yeah. And Terry, I don't know how you've done it so long, to be honest.
And Ayana, you make a good point. I mean, because you can pigeonhole yourself in a spot where you're always complaining about the lack of response from your government. You're complaining about the projects that haven't been met yet. And so you have to try to keep a positive outlook. And the way I found to do that was just surround myself with positive people. And the executive board at the NPU, they were positive. They kept me uplifted, and we all kept each other uplifted about this work that we have to do. That is such a grind. I agree, Ayana. But it matters, though.
And I think that speaks to we're not talking about individual action here. We're talking about collective action, making sure those associations and organizations are strong. So it all doesn't rest on one person's shoulders. even though at the heat of the moment when something is, you know, really sort of hot, it feels like, you know, I have to take on the world. But we thank each of you for joining us and for hopefully helping us keep positive as well. But this has been a really great conversation. We have recorded it. We'll share it with everyone who is here and post it online as well. This is something that we weren't doing quite as regularly pre-COVID as well. So regardless of sort of our previous circumstances, we've all had to adjust. But I think it's also given us the freedom and sort of grace to experiment with new things. So we appreciate you all being with us today. As we did mention before, we do have some upcoming events that we'll continue to talk about neighborhood associations and neighborhood power. So please stay connected. Please pay attention to what we've got going on. But as much as you can, you know, as socially distanced as possible, please be engaged with your neighbors. Please make sure that they're healthy, that they're safe. You know, as we have alluded to a little bit, or some of the involvement of how people got involved in the neighborhood association, they are social things. They're not just about business. People in the comments have talked about their sort of fun and other sort of activities. This is not here to be talking about, you know, just about the sort of power dynamics and making sure that decisions are made, but we're social human creatures and we need to have that sort of perspective as well. So please, over this long weekend, please participate in whatever way you can, whether it's a phone call, an email, a social media post that is kind and not political or belligerent or whatever else, but just being thoughtful of other folks that are out there. But we appreciate each of you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you out and about and in your neighborhoods when we're all safe and able to do so once again. But Asal, any last words from you before we close out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for panelists. You guys were incredible, and we're so excited to be able to host this conversation with each of you. Attendees, I hope that you gained something from this. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday. I'm going to retweet Ayana and saying, please take care of yourselves over this long weekend and in general with COVID. For the panelists, this call is going to end abruptly, just a heads up when we end it. But I will be sending a follow-up email to you guys, and we'll be moving on with next steps from there. Thank you guys so much for showing up and doing this work also. You know, it is not missed upon us how hard you guys work in this field. And I think what inspires me about this neighborhood work in general is there's so many unsung heroes and so many people on the ground that we don't even know that are fighting day in and day out for this city and day in and day out for what's happening. And y'all don't get as much recognition, you know, just generally, you know, and obviously the work isn't about recognition and having your name be known and all this and that. But we see you and we value you and really appreciate your time and your work, and look forward to continuing to uplift you guys and support in any way that we can, as a partner, as CCI, and also as neighbors in the city. So thank you all so much. If there's anything you need, feel free to reach out to us. If you are interested in continuing to keep the conversation going with CCI, feel free to hit us up. Kyle and I are really nice people and always have these kind of conversations, as we mentioned. So feel free to talk to us, and I hope you guys all have a happy Friday.
I'd like to make a really quick closing statement. And
Go ahead.
Thank goodness there are people like you who live in Atlanta.
Amen.
We will say that for everybody who's on this call. We appreciate you being here. That y'all are our neighbors, even though we might not be as physically proximate these days. But we appreciate all the work you've been doing, both pre-COVID, but particularly now, knowing all the other challenges we face, both economically and trying to deal with these long-standing racial and social justice issues that have been under the surface the whole time. But we definitely need to make sure that those are addressed for the long-term sort of health, safety, well-being of Atlantans going forward. So thanks once again for joining us. As Asal mentioned, this will be a very abrupt end, but if I can get a motion to adjourn, we'll go ahead and close out this meeting and let you have a good weekend. So.
Hey, thanks to everyone for attending and organizing this.
All right, thanks everybody.
All right, bye.